Okay, my opponent's going to lunge at me with his rapier, and I'm going to catch the rapier with my mangosh dagger. Like that. I trap his blade, like so, because his blade is then caught in the fork of my hilt, which is specifically designed for catching the blade, and if I can twist properly, to break it. Lunge. This is the lunge, the parry when the blade is caught by the mangosh dagger, and then the final stroke when the defender tries to break the attacker's blade. It's the en garde position, the stance which the fighter takes up, brings about to engage in combat. Fairly flexible, one foot in front of the other, ready to lunge or to parry as the occasion demands. This is a modern facsimile of a late 16th century rapier. The rapier was a sword normally carried by a gentleman. They were rather expensive to manufacture, much more so than the typical cavalryman or foot soldier's backsword. Typically the blades were manufactured in France or in Italy or in Germany. Many of them bear the name Andrea Ferrara, and the hilts were themselves often made abroad or by local indigenous hilt makers. The whole weapon is much lighter than the earlier medieval broadsword, and is primarily intended for thrusting as opposed to slashing. It is much more of a precision tool than the medieval broadsword, which appears as a mere bludgeon by comparison. The rapier came into fashion when duelling began itself to become very fashionable on the continent in the early 16th century, with the abandonment of armour and gentlemen settling their quarrels with rapiers and mangosh daggers. The blade itself is made of tempered steel, and this one is quite short. Some rapiers were much longer, sometimes the blades were as much as a yard or even 40 inches long. Fencing and duelling became enormously fashionable and enormously dangerous throughout the course of the 16th century, and a number of fencing masters set up schools in London and the other large cities throughout Europe, teaching gentlemen how to handle themselves and their weapons. The Italians, for much of the 16th century, led the way, and the Italian masters devised a particularly offensive form of fencing, depending almost entirely upon the thrust, using very long-bladed and hardened rapiers, aiming for the throat and the neck and the face, aiming to kill at any point. The English masters, most particularly George Silver, who was writing in the very late 16th century, in the 1590s, preferred a hybrid style of fencing with a mixture of offensive and defensive moves. We see this particularly well illustrated in the theatre of the time, and if one looks at the stage directions for the fight scenes in Romeo and Juliet, you will note that Tybalt, being the assassin type of character that he is, naturally prefers the rather ultra-aggressive Italian style, whereas Romeo fights with the English style, and of course Romeo wins. This is a more rudimentary form of sword. This is the backsword. The backsword is a type of weapon that would be carried by most border reivers throughout the later part of the 16th century. It is in some ways a cruder weapon than the rapier, though it is particularly designed to be used by a man on horseback. It's referred to as the backsword because in fact only one edge of the blade, only the leading edge of the blade, which I'm showing now, is sharpened. The reverse edge of the blade is not sharpened at all, and the weapon is therefore intended for the downward cut from the horseman. These weapons were often manufactured again using blades which were imported from either Italy or Germany. In this case, we have a blade which is imported from Italy and bears the name Andrea Ferrara. In addition to having the maker's name on the reverse of the blade, Andrea Ferrara, it also has the name of the man who had the sword made from, in this case, a member of the Douglas clan, and he's engraved his name, Ulfric Douglas McFakit, which in Latin, Ulfric Douglas had me made. He's also had the date upon which the sword was actually manufactured, engraved in the blade, and the sign of the swordsmith is also let into the blade. The hilt of this weapon is much more basic than the rapier. If we look, it has a simple wooden handle with a basket or cage hilt, which is made quite crudely and manufactured by local smiths. It does, however, as you will see, provide a fairly complete protection for the hand, and this piece, which I'm pointing to now, the pommel, serves as a counterweight and balance, and also is quite handy if you decide to shove the hilt in your opponent's face. An altogether cruder weapon than the rapier, but typical of those carried by border reivers. Some of these weapons had a rather intricate basket or Irish hilt, as it was referred to, and despite their rather clumsy appearance, were actually quite light. An existing backsword of the late 16th century in the Johnny Armstrong Museum of Arms and Armour actually only weighs 2.5 pounds, very light. This is what's called a hand and a half sword. It's referred to as a hand and a half sword because it could be used one-handed or it could be used double-handed. The grip on the double-handed sword was not quite the same as you might see in the movies, and it was actually held thus, with one hand firmly on the pommel to allow maximum flexibility of movement and also to add weight to a downward blow. This type of sword was starting to go out of fashion in the course of the 16th century, but was still carried by quite a number of foot soldiers. The Scots certainly were using hand and a half swords, not entirely dissimilar to this, right into the 17th century, and were using them through the Civil War period in the campaigns of Montrose. How these swords were made involved, for the standards of the time, a very high level of technology. The blades were patterned by the metal constantly being heated, folded, beaten, and then refolded and beaten again until the steel which was finally produced was very, very fine. It was very light in weight, but also very strong and very flexible in terms of the amount of wear and tear that it would sustain. And a good sword, well made, if it wasn't lost or somehow broken in battle, would last for several generations, and weapons were often handed down from father to son. From a very early time in the Middle Ages, the idea of sword bearing was linked to the status of a gentleman and to the status of chivalry, to knighthood. And when a knight did his vigil on the evening in which he was knighted, he had his sword with him in the church, and his sword was effectively blessed by the church as part of his status, as part of his approved armoury of knighthood. So the sword was not just a weapon, it was very much a badge of rank, it was a badge of office. And swords often acquired personalities of their own. The medieval period of the 16th century was an area of great superstition. So a man would give his sword a name, invest it with characteristics. And this was done even by the Vikings in the pre-Christian era. The Vikings gave their swords names in order to increase their mystical and magical potency and make them more effective in battle. The sword, even though it ceased to be used as a weapon of war by the 19th century, still survives today as a badge of rank among officer cadets at Sandhurst on other similar ceremonial occasions. But weapons like this in the 16th century were definitely used for real. This blade is inlaid with a Latin inscription, which was put on to the order of the owner by the swordsmith. A sword was not a mass-produced product. It was not something that one simply went into an armourer's shop and bought a sword. Swords were made, customised, I think would be the modern expression, for the needs of the wearer, in the same way as somebody might now buy an expensive English shotgun. And there is a Latin inscription inlaid into the blade, and in good 16th century tradition, the Latin is actually misspelt. The blade is also inlaid with the armourer's mark, the mark of the armourer who made it, which is inlaid on both sides of the blade, and the actual name of the owner is also inlaid with his own mark and his name in Latin on this side of the blade as well.